Hello, online pipe community. Ethan, parsimonious piper, and again this week I am together with,
Potter Piper.
and we are covering the very next letter in C.S. Lewis Screwtape letters. We're up to what, 18 now? Is
Yep,
that right?
that is
And
correct.
so, Father Brian, dive in.
My dear Wormwood, even under Slubgob, you must have learned at college the routine technique of sexual temptation. And since for us spirits, this whole subject is one of considerable tedium, though necessary as a part of our training, I will pass it over. But on the larger issues involved, I think you have a good deal to learn. The enemy's demand on humans takes the form of a dilemma, either complete abstinence or unmitigated monogamy. Ever since our father's first great victory, we have rendered the former very difficult to them. The latter, for the last few centuries, we have been closing up as a way of escape. We have done this through the poets and novelists by persuading the humans that a curious and usually short lived experience, which they call being in love, is the only respectable ground for marriage. That marriage can and ought to render this excitement permanent, and that a marriage which does not do so is no longer binding. This idea is our parody of an idea that came from the enemy. The whole philosophy of hell rests on recognition of the axiom that one thing is not another, and especially that one self is not another self. My good is my good, and your good is yours. What one gains, another loses. Even an inanimate object is what it is by excluding all other objects from the space it occupies. If it expands, it does so by thrusting other objects aside or by absorbing them. The self does the same. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. To be means to be in competition. Now, the enemy's philosophy is nothing more nor less than one continued attempt to evade this very obvious truth. He aims at a contradiction. Things are to be many, yet somehow also one. The good of oneself is to be the good of another. This impossibility he calls love, and the same monotonous panacea can be detected under all he does and even all he is or claims to be. Thus, he is not content, even himself, to be a sheer arithmetical unity. He claims to be three as well as one, in order that this nonsense about love may find a foothold in his own nature. At the other end of the scale, he introduces into matter that obscene invention, the organism, in which the parts are perverted from their natural destiny of competition and made to cooperate. His real motive for fixing on sex as the method of reproduction among humans is only too apparent from the use he has made of it. Sex might have been, from our point of view, quite innocent. It might have been merely one more mode in which a stronger self preyed upon a weaker. As it is, indeed, among the spiders where the bride concludes her nuptials by eating her groom. But in the humans, the enemy has gratuitously associated affection between the parties with sexual desire. He has also made the offspring dependent on the parents and given the parents an impulse to support it, thus producing the family, which is like the organism, only worse, for the members are most distinct, yet also united in a more conscious and responsible way. The whole thing, in fact, turns out to be simply one more device for dragging in love. Now comes the joke. The enemy described a marriage couple as one flesh. He did not say a happily married couple or a couple who married because they were in love. But you can make the humans ignore that. You can also make them forget that the man they called Paul did not confine it to married couples. Mere capitulation for him makes one flesh. You can thus get the humans to accept the rhetorical eulogies of being in love, but were in fact plain descriptions of the real significance of sexual intercourse. The truth is that wherever a man lies with a woman, there, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. From the true statement that this transcendental relation was intended to produce, and if obediently entered into, too often will produce, affection and the family, humans can be made to infer the false belief that the blend of affection, fear, and desire, which they call being in love, is the only thing that makes marriage either happy or holy. The error is easy to produce because being in love does very often in Western Europe precede marriages which are made in obedience to the enemy's designs. That is, with the intention of fidelity, fertility, and goodwill. Just as religious emotion very often, but not always, tends conversion. In the other words, the humans are to be encouraged to regard as the basis for marriage a highly colored and distorted version of something the enemy really promises as its result. Two advantages follow. In the first place, humans who have not the gift of continence, can be deterred from seeking marriage as a solution because they do not find it themselves in love. And thanks to us, the idea of marrying with any other motive seems to them low and cynical. Yes, they think that. They regard the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual love, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life as something lower than a storm of emotion. Don't neglect to make your man think the marriage service is very offensive. In the second place, any sexual infatuation, whatever, so long as it intends marriage, will be regarded as love, and love will be held to excuse a man from all the guilt and to protect him from all the consequences of marrying a heathen, a fool, or a wanton. But more of this in my next. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Well, right off the bat, Screwtape attacks or addresses the two sides of sexual immorality or morality that we most often think of, and one is complete abstinence. The other could be termed abstinence outside of marriage, or as he calls it, monogamy, unmitigated monogamy. Um, this is the dilemma that the enemy God puts us in, and Screwtape is very happy with the progress and the results that they've made on the former, in that humans, for the most part, do in fact find it very difficult to entirely abstain from sexual activity. Well, it's kind of how we were designed, and so to go against that design, it is difficult. So now, over the last couple of centuries, Lewis has Screwtape telling us that they've really been attacking the institution of marriage, because throughout time, that has been the way that we have funneled sexual energy into an acceptable to the enemy, an acceptable venue or format. So let's attack this notion of fidelity in marriage and lifelong fidelity, in particular, by promoting this notion that the only or the best, the primary motivation and foundation for a marriage uh, is this notion of being in love. Well, this notion didn't start with the Romantics. You can read stories in the Bible going all the way back to Rachel and Leah, that of a man's passion and love for one woman driving his desire to marry her. And so we see this going all the way back in time. It's not necessarily a new idea. What is different is that we have accepted the, as he calls it, the Romantics, the poets, the novelists' notion that when that romantic interest and love and emotion, when that fades and dies, then the marriage itself is no longer binding. And we see that we see that in today's divorce courts when we hear two couples saying they're getting divorced because of irreconcilable differences. Well, there is no such thing as an irreconcilable difference. Um, all differences are reconcilable. What they mean is they don't have that fuzzy feeling for each other anymore, so they're arguing more. They're not getting along, and they disagree about how to spend the money or how to spend their vacation, and so those differences are irreconcilable. Well, no, they're not. Anyone who has had a healthy decades long marriage knows that after 30 years, the fuzzy puppy love that you felt on the day of your wedding is one of those things that comes and goes. That emotion is not permanent, it's not lasting. But what you do get, and Lewis refers to this in a sense, the purpose of marriage and of sexuality being the means of reproduction for us, we get a unity, a type of love that is different than just puppy love and infatuation of being in love. And Screwtape really doesn't like this notion that somehow um, what's good for you can also be good for someone else, because he wants to make this a zero sum game. That if you gain, then I must lose. When in fact, the way love works, we both gain when you gain. I don't lose when my wife gains. And this is a new kind of love, and it models it parallels the love that the Godhead has. And Screwtape doesn't like this notion either. He calls it ridiculous, this arithmetical fallacy that um, that you can have three beings in one, and that somehow they love exists in between them. Well, that in fact is what we have. That's how God is represented, and our marriages are they are a model of that. They are or a copy, pale though it is, of that. Anyway, and getting back to my example, and anybody who's been in a healthy marriage for decades also knows that the love you have for your spouse is not, at this point in your life, a transitory thing. It is not something that comes and goes with emotion. Yes, we still have those times where everything is going great and we feel that spark of being in love the way we did in our early 20s. However, we've discovered something deeper, and that is what marriage truly is. It's a commitment between two people. It's not just a fuzzy feeling. And when we undermine that commitment, then Screwtape wins.
Exactly, Ethan. And as you were speaking about how Lewis is talking about being in love, and Screwtape is using that warm and fuzzy feeling to distract us, distract those, especially looking to a relationship that to distract from some of the more serious or long lasting, deeper intentions and relationship in which God has intended for us. And towards the end of the letter, Lewis gives he gives three that he mentions, where he says that to regard the intention of loyalty, he gives three with three intentions to marriage, not necessarily only to these three, but loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, for the preservation of chastity, and for the transmission of life. And all those three have a practical aspect that lead to a deeper spiritual reality and tension. I mean, when you know when He desires the intention of loyalty to a partnership for mutual help, it's ultimately to have us seek that loyalty to a partnership with God, and recognizing His loyalty, loyalty to us, and to be able to marriage is in a sense a living out a practice, for a lack of a better word, of that relationship with God, and more important, realizing His loyalty, to us, and the preservation of chastity. I think that's a powerful one. Because someone may look at it as, marriage and the ability to be able to have sexual relationship is only for the purpose that they don't, we would traditionally say the male, that the wandering eye doesn't, go to somewhere else and create to have an adulterous relationship. And there can be truth to that, but yet when we look at the preservation of chastity, chastity is not just a protection of not having relations with someone else, but it's the protection of one's heart. To have a chaste heart means I ultimately have a heart for God, that my heart is His and His is mine, and I'm living and practicing that with a spouse. And I think that relates to earlier in the book, in the letter, where Screwtape talks about uh, the fact of when a man lies with a woman, and he says, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. And I think that's quite something for us to ponder, in the sense of, because if we truly believe we're created body and soul, you can say body, mind, spirit, and soul, that there's a natural aspect and there's a supernatural aspect. And to just have sex, is that all it is? Or is there an intention for something deeper and greater? And in that, Lewis is really challenging us to think about that we are entering into something much greater than a physical orgasm, but that uh, there's a spiritual intention and to that. And and I'm sure many people, could look at their life and maybe look at how many partners they've had and so forth, and one can look at them as mistakes or sins. But I think what came to my mind and heart is not to look at the past and live in that, but I wonder how many our viewers will be watching, and to be able to take this to heart for their children and their grandchildren, to really give them a deeper sense of this relationship of a man and woman, of a marriage, and either to help them to be able to truly cherish, hopefully, the relationship and marriage that many who are watching have. If there's been challenges or mistakes and sins, we never want your children or grandchildren to, we always want them to be better than us, whether in success in the world or in their own deeper, spiritual life. And I'll end my part with, I come from a different viewpoint, from a celibate life, so I don't have the actual experience of marriage, but I work with many people who come usually with their problems. And so I do have a viewpoint of working with many different experiences. And I can say, I think this one letter has a lot to speak to many in the pew, but especially in how we raise and rear our children and grandchildren, to give them the proper intention and viewpoint of marriage and sex.
Piggybacking off of what you were saying about the chastity of the heart, it's interesting to me that the image of bride and groom is used extensively by Paul, but also by Christ himself in parables and stories. Uh, that there is a direct parallel in what ought to be between God's perfect fidelity to us and the fidelity that we should have to each other in the marriage relationship. And when we as the church are called the bride of Christ, Christ is the perfectly faithful groom. And particularly as heads of household, we men need to take that responsibility and that parallelism very seriously. Um, this notion that the fuzzies have to be the foundation for a marriage. Good grief, aren't you glad that God doesn't have to have the warm fuzzies for us? that that while we were still sinners, enemies of Him, Christ died for us. That's the kind of commitment, the kind of fidelity that it really is called for in human marriage, and yet we've created marriage, we've turned it into a throwaway institution that to the point where uh, and increasingly we're reaching the 50% tipping point from what I have read of children not being brought up in households with both parents here in the US. And that's a sad thing because that intact family is the model of love that God provides for us.
You brought something to mind. I At times it comes to my mind that I'm so thankful that God does not love me with the love I love Him, because my love is so imperfect.
Yeah.
And to be so reminded that, I mean, you obviously throughout all the scriptures, but you hear in the Old Testament, sometimes people think, it's just the angry God, and it's like, no, if you really listen to it, this is a God that is so passionately loyal and committed to the covenant, to
Hmm.
that relationship, that He will get angry, because He truly, I mean, that commitment is so deep. Jesus is the full expression of that love and commitment of covenant. And and what Screwtape has been able to do, and I always think it's important for myself, but for viewers, when they ponder this and discern this, is always to think, what is Screwtape's end game with whatever subject we're looking at? What does he want
Right.
to pull us away? And to to drop that ideal that there is there is really no way God can be that loyal, that loving, and He could die on the cross for me, knowing I do not deserve it. I am not often enough grateful for it. And so let's lower our ideal of marriage, of sexual relation, because there's no way I can live up to it. And I'm sure there's probably men, and I don't want to exclude women, but I think we men, will say things like, well, boys will be boys. And usually
Mhm.
that's just an excuse to, well, it happened, and to really say no. I mean, I'm going to fall, we're going to fall. Never lower the ideal,
That's right.
never lower God's, His fierce loyalty to us. We always strive for it, and whatever we don't reach that perfectly, we reach out to Him, knowing He will be the one who can perfect us if we want it and we desire that, and we go to Him.
Yeah, there are just there are so many parallels between the male female relationship, both the marriage aspect and the sexual aspect of it. That in terms of union, and like you brought up, that Screwtape talks about that just the act of copulation creates a spiritual relationship. It creates a transcendent relationship that that never truly ends. You either go on to right the wrong and get married and live faithfully that way, or you live forever with the memory of something that happened and an unspoken connection between the two people involved. um I, there isn't another way around it, really. And there there is such a parallel in terms uh of the that marriage love, like I was saying, with the fidelity of God to us, um, we have trashed the notion of fidelity in marriage lasting beyond the warm fuzzy feelings, and it truly being um, love being a commitment to the other person, and that's a love that you don't actually understand between you and your wife until you've been married a while, because you've never experienced it until that point.
And how often, and we that whether we remember in our school days, maybe college days, that the especially the man, but maybe the woman, but you know for a man to wait until marriage to have sex, you know you can look in many different shows, comedies, that's always the person made fun of. And
Hmm.
you know how can and why do we do that? Because most people, most men, have not been able to do that. And so I think it's just there's kind of a natural making fun of someone, like, oh, you haven't lived, you haven't done this. Uh, and just because of our faults and failings, um, that's what we really should look to you know our children and grandchildren to. Not, I mean, goody two shoes in the negative way of that word can mean, but to realize that to live to that ideal is something that's the truly hard, sacrificial. I mean, that to really be a man, that's what it would really be to be
Hmm.
a man, to want to strive to that. And just because we might not be able to do that, let's not tear the other down, and let's not tear that ideal down. Let's build it up, even if any of us haven't made that. Let's not tear down the ideal and God's desire for us.
Well, and the danger too that we we anthropomorphize God. We make him man like instead of recognizing who he is and that his nature is not our nature. Um, and we run a real risk of looking around us and seeing the weakness and infidelity of man in his relationship within families, and translating that, projecting that then onto God, that well, maybe God isn't really as faithful as he says. I mean, look, we call him Father, but look at the fathers we see around us. They're so imperfect. We as fathers are so imperfect. Um, maybe God isn't as good and as faithful as we have been told he is. We really run a risk like that, that we diminish him instead of maintaining our own level of expectation to match his standard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's yeah, that might be a good wrap up right there. The Because I mean, yeah, because you're right on this subject. We could just keep. There's so
We,
much to it.
yeah,
You
yeah.
could really just. I mean,
So much more than our time format allows.
yeah, this is a real deep one. This affects a lot of. Yeah, it really is.
Hmm. All right. Well, then let's wrap it up right there. Folks, I hope that this has given you something to think about, and that regardless of what you have in your past, whether it's sexual failures or relational failures, that you will know God is faithful. He's perfectly faithful, and he wants to have that relationship with you. So until next time, light something you like. We'll see you next week.